Get your coffee, get a hot donut.
Yeah.
Be sure to save one till the end of class so I can have one. You ready over there, Taylor? All right, we are, well, glad you're here for this now fifth study in our looking at Joshua and Judges and Ruth. One of the interesting things for me standing up here is to see who gravitates to the back or who comes to the front, and that shifts from week to week. It's interesting to see who's involved in those kinds of episodes. All right, we're ready, as I said, for lesson 5. If you haven't been paying close attention, this is the last lesson on the book of Joshua. You have made it all the way through the book of Joshua. Have you ever done that before in your life? No. Did you read the sections for today? This was some of the better reading. Yeah. Okay, good.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I'm just interested. Why did you select Joshua, Judges, and Ruth to do the Bible study instead of maybe Mark and John and
Because
some more interesting people?
Because to some degree, you all know something, or at least think you know something about Mark and John. But I figured you didn't know diddly about Joshua and Judges
That's true.
and Ruth.
That's true.
So I say this only tongue-in-cheek, but I can basically say anything I want and you won't know any better.
That's true. That is true. So true.
Hopefully it's a little more than that. But,
That's being honest.
well, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. God, again and again, your word makes clear that justice grown strident wears your patience thin. And when you act on behalf of your people, you sweep away those who cling to the way things are, as surely as you upend their status quo. Now, Jesus' mother said as much long ago, but our own desire to be numbered sometimes among the well-positioned and well-to-do blinds us to the ways that we are ourselves propping up the very structures that you are tearing down. May we, like the Hebrews of old, choose wisely whom we will serve. Set our eyes on the goal before us and our hands to the work that you give us, that our hearts may in time align fully with yours. Amen. Well, Hebrews have entered the land of Canaan. That was chapters 1 through 5. And they actually were able to possess the land. That was chapters 6 through 12. And then they took time to actually distribute the land among themselves. That was chapters 13 through 21. So it seems at this point that God has done everything for the Hebrews that God said he would. And the Hebrews have responded pretty much accordingly. They have accepted what they have been offered and they have inhabited it. So there is only at this point a few little mopping up exercises, or at least I should say really one mopping up exercise left to do, and that's where we start the lesson today. You remember that when they got ready to actually cross the Jordan, one of the responsibilities, one of the last commands that Moses gave to those tribes that wanted to stay on the east side of the Jordan River was that they would have to help the other tribes actually possess the land of Canaan itself. And so as we've worked our way through the book of Joshua, we discovered that yes, indeed, the Transjordanian tribes lived up to the promise that they had made to Moses, and they came over and helped all of those other 9.5 tribes actually win the battles that they had to fight against the Canaanites and other groups that lived within Canaan itself. Okay, with that background, if you remember where we ended up last week, the very last thing that happened was that the Levites said, okay, everybody's got land but us. And so the Levites were given 48 cities. More or less, they were given 4 cities in each of the 12 tribal areas where they would be able to live. Now that's actually, on the side here, that's actually one of those wonderful things that we can say God sort of worked out. Instead of putting all the priestly types in one place, he distributes, if you will, the clergy throughout the entire land so that they can be of assistance to the people in fairly short space. I mean, that was a wonderful thing that they did. So you didn't have to go very far to be able to run across a Levite as a result of that. All of that took place at Shiloh, where they had also, for the first time in quite a while, it was the first time that they had actually set back up the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, in which all of the Holy of Holies and all of that type of thing was. So that was set up at Shiloh. The assumption as we jump into chapter 22 is that the folks are still at Shiloh, that the Levites have just been told that they get to have those 48 cities. And before everybody begins to now leave, Joshua says, oh, and one more thing. And that allows us to jump in now to chapter 22. That, oh, and one more thing is that he addresses the Transjordanian tribes, specifically the soldiers, but all of the other folks married to and connected with the soldiers in the Transjordanian tribes. Joshua says to them, you all have done exactly what you said you would do. Moses had commanded you to help out, to assist militarily until the Hebrews were able to actually possess the land and have peace and rest throughout the land. You did that. You did that, and so now it's time to release you so that you can go back and actually inhabit your homes on the far side, on the trans side of the Jordan, the Transjordanian side. And so that's where we start off here in chapter 22. Because the 9.5 tribes on the west side, what we now call Israel itself, what then was called Canaan, because they have now had rest or peace, security, now they are able to go home and enjoy the same thing themselves. One quick word about peace or rest. It doesn't just mean that you can sit back and go, it means that you have the ability to be able to make a living, to inhabit the place that you are at in full security without fears that you're going to lose that which you have. So it's the enablement to live a full life. That's where the Hebrew tribes now are on the west side of the Canaan. And the assumption is that these Transjordanian tribes are going to be able to have exactly the same thing back on the east side. Even though they have been gone for 7 years, the assumption is that they're able to go back to that area, that it hasn't been taken back over by anybody, that they can just simply go back to those areas that they now have and establish their lives in the same way. Joshua gives them a charge. Incidentally, this is what Shiloh looks like today. I showed this picture very quickly last week when I realized that we were out of time. Like all of these archaeological sites, it's really difficult to tell much of anything. But that's at least one artist's rendition of what it might have looked like at the time when they first set up the tent of meeting or the tabernacle, which you can see in this drawing is that enclosed area. And inside of those tinted barriers, you can see something that looks like a loaf of bread rising up in the midst of it. That's the tent of meeting itself, covered with the dolphin skins or whatever it was that actually covered it.
So the one that you showed of today, who lives there?
This picture?
Anyone?
Doesn't look like anybody lives
I
there.
just see that vehicle there.
Oh, yeah, that's some archaeologist hanging out, probably still in his vehicle so he doesn't have to show his
It
face.
doesn't look like anybody.
And a lot of tourists go there, we visited there,
Yeah.
so you see a lot of people there, nobody's living there.
Okay.
And another thing, that reminds me of is that when the tribes would come and gather, when they all needed to be together, that's at a lower point, right?
Yeah.
So the tribes would be gathered on the hillsides around it, so everyone could kind of see what was going on down in that area.
Yeah, it's not quite as low as like Shechem was or is, but yes, you're right. And that's really what I was going to say is if this picture were bigger, you could see, you'd be able to see people living around, but not exactly right there. That got me slightly ahead, but that's okay. So Joshua says to them, I'm releasing you to go home. Everybody's happy about that, but you don't just get to go home and do whatever. You do have some responsibilities once you get home. God has done all of these things for us with your help, but now when you go home, you need to maintain the same type of obedience to the law that God has shared with us through Moses that you've already begun to do. You can't grow lax on that. You need to continue to follow those laws. You need to remain loyal to Yahweh, who is your God, as much as the 9.5 tribes on the other side. You need to walk in obedience to all that God has said to us that we need to do. In short, you need to serve God with your heart and with your soul, just as you have been doing for these 7 years while you have served time as military. And so, as they get ready to leave, Joshua pronounces a blessing upon them and tells them as they leave, oh, and one last thing, all of that wealth and plunder that you now have, that you're taking back home, be sure that you share that with everybody so that everybody is able to have some of that. Don't just keep it yourselves. Share it with everyone. That gets us then to verses 10 through 12. Intriguingly, they take off from Shiloh, which is a little bit further in from the Jordan River. It's not right next to the Jordan River. It's in quite a ways. But as they make their way back across, so they get to the point where they can actually cross the river and be more or less home, they stop on the west bank of the Jordan River. And if you read the text, you know that they take time to build a huge altar. Really a curious thing for them to do. And they don't build the altar on the east side of the river, which is the side they're going to live on. They build this huge altar on the west side of the river, the area that they're getting ready to leave behind. That's really a strange thing, because back at Shiloh, they've set up the tent of meeting. And one of the things that is now set up there is the altar on which you are going to establish sacrifices for the Hebrew people. But here these people who have just been praised for all the wonderful things that they have done, the very last thing they do before they cross the river is they set up an altar of their own. Well, the other 9.5 tribes somehow or other get word of this, whether it's that a few traveled with them or word has just gotten back to them. We're not told how this happens, but the tribes, the other 9.5 tribes, they hear about this huge altar that has been built on the west side of the Jordan River, and before the Transjordanian tribes can even themselves get across the river and go on their way, the folks back at Shiloh get up in arms about it, start mouthing off to each other about the crazy things that the Transjordanian tribes have just done, building this altar, and they get so riled that they gather back up all of their armaments and go marching off to now make war against the very soldiers that have been helping them accomplish everything they have done for the last 7 and a half years. Joshua has just expressed gratitude for them, offered a blessing upon them, and now they want to kill them all. Kind of sounds like the church today, doesn't it? How many times have God's people, on the basis of some kind of gossiped report that nobody has gotten down to the nitty-gritty about, decided to go off the rail against whoever it is that's done this crazy thing? I'm glad you're all sitting there with eyes down and seeing it. We've never- There's better ways to do this than to go off half-cocked at somebody who does something that we don't think is appropriate. If I had lots and lots of time, there's a lot of things I'd like to say right here. But let me just try to encapsulate it pretty tightly. One of the reasons why we take the time in every worship service to affirm our faith in the words of the creed is to remind us that these are the things that it's okay for us as people of faith, people of the Christian faith, to get riled up about. If Dixon decides, well, I don't believe in the resurrection, even though the creed says right there something about the resurrection. Or he says, I don't think there is any forgiveness of sins, even though it says right there is. That's grounds to be able to go to Dixon and go, okay, what's up? What's happening here? Those things that are in the creed are the things that the church as a whole, I don't mean just this little pocket or that little pocket, but the church as a whole has said, this defines us. This is who we are. This we believe. Period. Now, it doesn't say specifically what you must believe, or even how much you must believe, but it says this we believe. So there's even wiggle room within that, but there's a playing field. What it doesn't say is that it matters what your political party is. It doesn't say anything about what you believe about certain social constructs or anything else. Doesn't say a word about that, which effectively says that it doesn't matter, should not matter to us as church what political party people belong to. That's not grounds to question somebody's faith. Depending upon which political party you belong to, there may be grounds for questioning your basic intelligence, but there isn't any grounds for questioning your faith. You as a faithful person can belong to any political party, you can believe in whatever social construct you want, and it's okay. We can have conversations about that, but there are parameters. There's nothing that the Transjordanian tribes have done that in and of itself was inappropriate. But the 9.5 tribes have gone off half-cocked and think that there was and are ready actually to kill them. And so they get together. Phinehas, that's the son of Eleazar, the high priest, which means he's the grandson of Aaron, the brother of Moses. He's the guy who you may remember, those of you who were in the Numbers study, however long back that was, 4 years ago. At the tail end of the book of Numbers, just when they're waiting on the East Bank, getting ready to go in, there is this hullabaloo that happens, and there's a plague that begins to hit because the Midianites have been trying to convince the Hebrew people not to be faithful to God, but to follow after their own gods, the Baals that they go after. And one of the ways that they begin to convince the Hebrew people to leave Yahweh behind is that they introduce a girly chorus line that intrigues at least all of the men at that particular moment in time. And they get all excited about that. And there's this plague that breaks out, and they start dying by the thousands. And there's even a point where one of the Hebrew men stridently walks in with a Midianite woman on his arm, and they go into their tent, and I don't need to say any more about that, but Phinehas grabs a spear and goes running he sees all of this, and he goes running into the tent, takes his spear, and stabs both of them, pins them both to the ground. And if you think I'm making stuff up, go back into the book of Numbers, and you can see that there it is. Phinehas is the archetypical priest who takes matters into his hands and does things on behalf for God. He acts. He doesn't just talk, he acts. Now that's only been 7-ish years ago, just right before they got into the land. So all of these tribes elect Phinehas to be the one to lead the troops as they go attack now the Transjordanian tribes there at the Jordan River. And when they arrive, they accuse them of all these things that we just said, including reminding them of that story where 24,000 people died, as well as the fact that Achan, who stole the money when they got into Jericho, that, it wasn't just those two people back on the East Bank that died. It was 24,000 people that died. And when Achan did this, all of the Hebrew tribes were suddenly suspect. Well, what on earth are these Transjordanian tribes thinking? Pulling some stunt like this, setting up an altar that appears to be attempting to divide God's people between the one at Shiloh and the one here now at the Jordan River. And they continue saying a whole bunch of other things as well, but they end by saying, look, if your land is already so defiled that you don't even want to go back, well, just stay here. This is holy land here, unlike that land over there that you guys are getting ready to go to. Well, the Transjordanian soldiers look appalled. They look shocked at what they had just been told by Phinehas and as well as the rest of the tribes, and say, you've got this all wrong. We didn't build this altar. I mean, number one, look at the size of it. It is immense. It's huge. It's not even a workable altar. It's way too large to be able to sacrifice anything on it anyway. We know that we just left where you put the altar there in Shiloh. We didn't build this to use. We built this to look at and to be effectively a memorial where, because we think, and the way you're acting, they don't say this in Scripture, but we can add it, and the way you're acting, we're probably right about this. We're afraid that when we go on across the river, that as time goes on, you're going to forget all about us and begin to see us not as a part of you, but a part that is against you. So we built this altar for you as well as for our children to be able to function as a long-term memory, a memorial that we are a part of each other, and that this altar reminds us of the God that we serve together. And they say some more things. Well, they are able to convince Phinehas that they are telling the truth, that there wasn't any reprehensible action that they engaged in, that they were in fact doing something that was entirely appropriate. Dixon isn't saying that ultimately that resurrection didn't happen or that there's no forgiveness of sins. He just had a different take on it. that was intriguing. And so there was room to think and reflect on all of that. And so the Transjordanian tribes go on about their way, and Phinehas and the 9.5 tribes that have showed up to kill them all, they simply go back home. And that is the end of the story, except for one little piece. Right at the tail end, the altar ends up getting a name. And the name is a witness between us that Yahweh is God. I ended up reading a book this last week that somebody in here gave me to read, telling me that it was really something. Turned out it wasn't any much of a much. This story ended up not being any much of a much, but it was the mopping up exercise that had to be done. The soldiers had to go home. They did. They did something on the way that caused some others to think something funky was happening when it wasn't. Everything was cool. And so there it is. Which brings us to chapter 23. Chapter 23 takes place sometime later. We don't know how much later sometime is. Caleb, we know how old he was. He was 85. And we were able to kind of construct some time elements on the basis of that. We're never told how old Joshua was. We're not told how old Joshua is. By the end of Joshua, we're going to be told how old he was when he died, but that doesn't help us. We only know that chapter 23 happened sometime after 22. And make it 2 years, make it 25 years, it's perfectly reasonable. We just don't know. Earlier, at the time when Caleb was said to be 85, Joshua was said to be old. In fact, he was said to be very old. Which is why God, looking at him, said, you know, I think we better stop fighting and we better start dividing up the land. You ain't got much time left is the undercurrent there. So we need to get this taken care of. Well, more time has passed, and Joshua is even older. And so he calls together all of the tribal leaders, and there's a list, not of people's names, but a list of the various kinds of tribal leaders that he brings together. And he begins to remind them of a lot of things that God has done on their behalf. And I don't need to go into great detail about all of these, but it reminds them what God has actually accomplished for them. And the highlights. Got you over here into this land, actually enabled you to possess the land. God has constantly been fighting on your behalf. And one of the things we learn through all of this is that Joshua tells the tribal leaders very candidly, yes, you fought, but it was not due to your fighting that you now have the land. You have the land because God dispossessed the other folks. God has done this fighting for you. We'll have to come back to that in just a little bit. So God has done the fighting. God has allotted the land for the various tribes. And then the last thing that he says is that God has already promised as well that God is going to continue fighting on your behalf in the days to come, so that you'll be able ultimately to drive out all of the Canaanites that are left here. So effectively, within these early verses of chapter 23, Joshua is encouraging the folks to be reflective, to think back over at least the last 7 years of their life, and to consider where they have been and where they are now. It's not a bad thing for people of faith of any time period to do. It's one of those things that we do, at least at some level, if we engage in Lenten practices, for instance. We take time to reflect on where we have been, what we once did, what we no longer do, what we still need to incorporate within our life, how far we have come in faith, how much further we have yet to go. All of those things are really important. And we don't do it just in Lent itself. It's something that some of us may do on the anniversary of our baptism. It may be something we do on the anniversary of our decision to become a part of a local church. Maybe 100 other reasons why we do it. Bottom line is, it's one of those good practices to engage in. That's different from the kind of navel gazing that some folks will do. But it is something that is good for us from time to time to do. If for no other reason, because when you do it from time to time, it enables you to see what all God has been doing on your behalf. From this day to the next day, you may not see much difference in yourself. But when you look at yourself today versus the way you were 5 years ago or 20 years ago, hopefully you can see there have been immense changes. You've been able to accomplish, you've been able to get control of lots of things, and you've been able to surrender lots of things to God over a lengthier period of time. Now, the flip side of that is that if you look at yourself today versus 20 years ago and you're pretty much identical, there are some issues there you may need to begin to address in your life. So Joshua takes time to reflect on all that God has done for them, which leads to, there are some things that you now need to begin to really take ownership and responsibility for. There's some things you need to do. And this is coming from one who knows he is very old, who knows that he's about to go the way of all things mortal, and he's not going to be able to tell the Hebrews this again. And so this is really a last word of testament to them. You guys really need to work on this. So he first tells them that you need to pay attention to all that God has told us in the book of the law of Moses. There's a book that's been mentioned on a couple of occasions prior to this, but the last time we saw it in the book of Joshua was way back in chapter 1. Some people say that this is the book of Deuteronomy. Some people say it's like the Ten Commandments and all that shows up from the Ten Commandments all the way to the end of Deuteronomy. I think the specifics don't matter. The bottom line is, he's saying you need to heed God's law. You need to pay attention to what God has shared with us. Secondly, not only is there something that you need to do, there is something that you need to not do. And the thing that you need to not do is begin to associate so closely with the Canaanites who are left in the land that you abandon your own positions of faith. And the specific thing that he mentions here is intermarrying. Don't marry a Canaanite. Don't have your son or your daughter marry a Canaanite. There are certainly groups within the church, even today, who will say, you are a Baptist, don't marry anybody but a Baptist. That's not what Joshua is saying. He's saying, don't marry a person not of the Hebrew faith. Don't marry somebody who worships Baal. Well, okay, two things there. One, he's talking about a very specific kind of associating. It's okay to have friends. It's okay to have business deals. It's okay to interact with. How would you not? Life is life, and not everybody is Hebrew, or today not everybody is Christian. Not everybody's Jewish. Not everybody's fill in the blank. You're going to have interactions with. But that's different from becoming so cozy with another person that you begin to abandon principles, that you begin to abandon positions that truly matter to a person of for us the Christian faith. Once you've done that, once you start sloughing pieces of your faith off to be able to hold on to this relationship, you've really gone way too far. You have, in some ways, according to the strict letter of the code here, you've begun to leave the Christian faith behind. And so he's warning them, one of the ways that that is easily done in a way that you don't even quite see it on the front end is through intermarriage. You know, we all know that marriage is tough enough as it is, all the things you got to deal with in marriage, that you don't need to add to it all of the other pieces where principles begin to get compromised, et cetera, along the way. Now, I know that for most of us, if not all of us, throughout our entire life, if anybody has said to us, well, you can't tell me who I can marry or not marry, that's my choice. Well, yes, it is, but it's good to be wise about that as opposed to unwise about it. And so he's encouraging them to think very deeply about the kinds of relationships that you establish with other people and why, and what that means down the road in your relationships with them. And then he says, hold fast to the Lord, which is just really the more positive way of saying what he just said. Be faithful to God. Be faithful to God the same way that you expect to be faithful in marriage. Don't do the kinds of compromising that would tear your relationship with God apart. Do those things that would unite you even closer. And finally, down at the tail end of this, in verse 11, he just sums it all up by saying, look, whatever you do in days to come, love the Lord. Well, it sounds rather like what the Christian faith has finally come down to, isn't it? Love God. If you love God, most everything else, if you truly love God, most everything else can fall by the wayside. But the important line here is that there are things that they must do, hold firm to Mosaic teachings, and there are things that they must not do. Don't compromise your faith via relationships that you have. And then he goes into a little bit more specifics about what they must avoid in days to come. These are the warnings that he tells them. And he picks back up on all of that intermarriage stuff. I don't think we need to go into great detail really at this point, but it's an important thing. And the simple fact that it is that important that he keeps coming back to it over and over again in these chapters is, if nothing else, enough of a word of warning to us that, you know, it's something to consider. It's something to take into account, how we live our lives. And the bottom line in these verses, once you get down to the tail end of the chapter, is this. As certain as it is that God blesses us in covenant with God, as certain as that is, it is just as certain that God will withhold blessing if you don't remain firm in the covenant. Try to cut corners. If you decide, oh, I know God says, but, and go off a different direction, you don't really have room to expect God to keep blessing you because you have broken covenant. To use an example today, this is stretching, but run with me on this. Sam Walton, God, hires you, makes you a Christian. He hires you, and in that contract, he promises health care, provisions, salary, food, clothing, shelter, blah, 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 blah. Your responsibility, part of the covenant is, you will work for me. You will show up, 9 to 5 or whatever. Cool. He hires you, you say, great. And so things are for a couple of years. And then your wanderlust begins to kick in. And you wonder what it might be like to work for, not Sam Walton, but for J.C. Penney or whoever. And ultimately you leave Sam Walton and you get hired by J.C. Penney. But another 6 months down the road, all the promises that J.C. Penney's made to you are not quite as good as it seemed on the front. And the money's not quite as good, and the health care is lacking, and well, bottom line, you go back to Sam and say, I really want my salary again. I really want the health care you provide. And Sam tells you, well, you don't work for me anymore. You broke covenant. You broke the contract. It's not in place anymore. Okay, really poor example, but I think you can fit it into the issue of faith that's being talked about here. If you break faith with God, you don't have any room ultimately to be able to say, where's my health care? Where's my peace and rest and security? God will ultimately say to the Hebrew people, not right here, but a little bit later, when we get into the book of Judges, he will say, look, if you want to run after other gods and it doesn't work out quite as well, complain to the God that you want to be a part of. Don't complain to me about it. I already told you that was going to be the way it was, but you didn't listen. Make your nest where you are now and deal with it. A couple sections of verses that apply here. I'm not going to spend any time on them, but a couple sections of verses that you may want to take a note and go to in your own occasion later. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 4 through 6, and Hebrews chapter 10, verses 26 through 31 deal from a Christian perspective with what Joshua is saying to the tribes at this point. Be sure that you hold firm to the covenant. Don't go breaking it and going after other gods. You're going to regret it if you do. Stay firm with God. And that gets us to chapter 24 and the tail end of the book. Presumably this happens just right after chapter 23. But Joshua again recalls all that God has done on behalf of the Hebrew people, and this time he goes into a whole lot more detail, going all the way back to the call of Abraham, through his son Isaac, through his sons Jacob and Esau, down to Moses in Egypt, the Exodus itself, the getting them over to the Jordan River, the taking them across the Jordan River, the whole thing. He walks them through all of that. This particular story takes place at Shechem. We've seen this place before on a couple of occasions. You may remember Mount Ebal up there earlier. There was an occasion after Ai is defeated. This is where they go up to reestablish covenant, back in the middle of the book of Joshua. They're not up on the mountaintop at this point. They're down in the valley within Shechem itself. Back when we visited Mount Ebal, I mentioned at that point that Shechem is the first place that is mentioned when Abraham comes into Canaan. He stops there and builds an altar and says, it's good to be in the land that you have given to me, God. What's next? God doesn't really tell him, so he goes a little bit further south to Ai, or to Bethel, actually, right next to Ai, and builds another altar. But we're back at Shechem, and this is where Joshua will end up having this final story to share with the Hebrew people before he dies. It's within this group of verses that God kind of cuts the legs out from underneath the Hebrew people and says, even though you think you have been doing all of this fighting against the Canaanites, it's really God on your behalf. God has done that for you. And I'll just let that be with nothing more. But he does follow it up by saying, you'll recall that I sent the hornet before you. And it's the hornet that has accomplished all these things on your behalf. We don't know what the heck the hornet was or what the hornet is. But there are a couple of occasions in the Old Testament where that word that gets translated as hornet also gets translated as, well, it doesn't get translated this way in the Bible itself, but it could be translated as chaos or panic. And so the hornet, whatever it was, it introduced such strife and mayhem that people didn't know what to do, and they just started running around like headless chickens. And it's in light of the hornet and the panic that they start killing each other off, literally. You just don't know what's going on. They're killing each other off, and the Hebrews are just standing back watching it, if you will, such as at Jericho. The first time that the hornet is mentioned is all the way back at Mount Sinai. God tells Moses, look, when we finally get off the mountain and we're getting ready to move into Canaan itself, I'm going to send the hornet in front of you, and the hornet is going to do the fighting on your behalf. Blah, 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 blah. That way you'll be able to possess the land. Now, the hornet isn't going to get rid of everybody in the first year. That won't do you any good. There aren't enough of you to possess the whole land. So it's going to take a while. I'm going to let the hornet work for several years so that you can ultimately infiltrate all the land, and that makes a whole lot more sense. You get to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, the hornet is introduced a second time with almost identical words. I'm going to send the hornet in front of you. It's going to introduce panic. It's ultimately going to do the fighting on your behalf so that you can possess the land, although it's not going to happen immediately, blah, blah, blah. And here it is now a third time. The first time, this was like a good sermon. First time, God says, here's what I'm going to do. The second time, here's what I am doing. And now, here's what I have done. I sent the hornet before you, and it has accomplished all the things that I said that it would actually do. So, Joshua is saying that God has fulfilled all of God's promises to you. There's not a promise that God has made to you that has not been fulfilled. As a result, you now have land on which you didn't toil. You have cities that you didn't build, and you're eating crops that you didn't plant. You're welcome, says God. Which was it you who mentioned who lives there? Here's Shechem today. If you focus on just that little piece of land, it looks like it's in the middle of nowhere. But there's all the city around that archaeological site. There's another perspective. This is at the far of that previous picture. It's at the far right end, and they've really done a close-up. And what that matters is that you can see the standing stone. Here's a close-up of it, a standing stone. That leads us into the last part of chapter 24, where there is a new covenant agreement that is made. Joshua tells the people, look, before I die, I'm going to make sure that you actually begin to fulfill what you have told God. God's done everything God said God was going to do. It's another story on your side. You haven't yet ultimately been faithful. It's time to put up or shut up. And so verses 14 through 28 talk about this covenant agreement. It's his statement to them, it's time for you to fulfill your side of the equation. And the first thing that he tells them is really a shock. All those household gods that you've been carrying around with you, All the little balls that you've got in your pockets, you need to throw them away. You can't continue to hold on to them. The contemporary version of that is, look, if you're going to leave sin behind, you've got to leave sin behind. You can't keep your little pet sins. It doesn't work that way. All means all. Get rid of them all. Now granted, some of them may be a little more difficult for you to address and deal with, and that's why you've got the remainder of your life to work on. But you can't just say, it's mine and I will do with it as I please. He says to the Hebrews, you've got to get rid of your household gods. If you're going to serve God, one of the first things you've got to realize is that that means only. You can't serve God and. Remember, Jesus will say something about that during his lifetime. Can't serve God and mammon. Can't serve God and fill in the blank. It's God or not. End of discussion. And so he says to them something that occurs nowhere else within the pages of Scripture. Choose you this day whom you will serve. It's the only place in Scripture where you get to choose the God that you want to serve. We think that we are choosing which God we want to serve, but this is the only place where it actually says that. The more normal way that the church talks about that is that God calls you and you respond. Your choice is really a response to the choice. God chose you, and you say, me? Well, yeah, that's your choice. It's not, oh, I'm going to take this or I'm going to take that. So the Hebrew people, faced with this dilemma that they've got to get rid of all of the household gods that they thought on the side holding on to, they decide, yeah, we will get rid of them. Yes, we will serve God alone. Yes, we do choose God as the one whom we will serve. And no sooner do they actually say that than Joshua responds by saying, I don't believe you. It's usually not best for clergy to say that to folks, but Joshua gets away with it at this particular moment in time. And he reminds them of how serious this covenant agreement is. I want you to pay close attention to what you were saying. You can't just say it. You've got to do it, because God is holy. Holiness is not righteousness. Righteousness is what comes out of holiness. Holiness means God is unique. God is one. There's nothing like God. You can't believe on the front end that serving God is going to be like serving any other God. It's completely different. God, and then he begins to go into the details. God is, for instance, jealous. If Bud says, well, I'm going to serve God, and God says, no, you're not. It's me or the highway, period. God doesn't tolerate any kind of ands. It just doesn't work that way. So he insists that this is the only way that you can serve God. Serve God fully. And the people say, we understand. We're getting rid of our other gods. We're going to serve God fully. And so at the tail end of the book of Joshua, Joshua ends up cutting a new covenant with the Hebrew people in which they pledge their loyalty, lifelong loyalty to God alone. And as part of this covenant agreement, it's just like any other covenant agreement, it says this is what God will do, this is what you can expect from God, and this is what God can expect from you. Those are the terms of the covenant that is being established. And as a result, they set up that standing stone that you saw. Now, that's probably not the original standing stone in Shechem, but they've set up a standing stone that functions as a memorial to this agreed upon statement, the same way that the Transjordanian tribes set up that altar as a memorial to say, here is what we are choosing to do moving forward. And it sounds as if, when we get to the end of the book of Joshua, things just could not be better. It's ending on a wonderful note with just one last piece of mopping up to do. Joshua was an old man. He was a very old man. And he finally went the way of all things mortal. And when he died, they buried him in the city that he had given to himself, Timnath Serah. He was 110 years old. I don't know that it matters how old he was, but he was 110 years old. In Egyptian beliefs, a person who lives 110 years has led a perfect life. That just shows you were all right. He lived 110 years. And do you know who else lived 110 years? I know you're all holding back because you all read this and you know what it says, but his forebear, Joseph, he lived 110 years. Well, so this is not good since we're kind of mopping everything up here at the end of Joshua. They buried this perfect man, Joshua, who did a wonderful job leading the Hebrews after Moses, worthy successor. He dies at 110, they bury him. And you know what? Joseph was 110 years too, and he too was a perfect man. And they buried Joseph's bones. But if you remember back in the story, the Egyptians actually embalmed Joseph. And he left word with them, when I die, you keep hold of my bones, keep hold of my body. I don't want my bones being buried here in Egypt. You get them back to Canaan, because that's where you're ultimately going to get. You keep track of them, take them with you, and when you get to Canaan, bury me with my forefathers. Well, that's the other thing that's important about Shechem. After Abraham built that altar there, get down to Jacob, Jacob ends up buying that land so that he and his sons can be buried in Shechem. And that is where Jacob is buried. And that's where many of Joseph's brothers ultimately were buried. And so Joseph ends up being buried there as well. Okay, so Joseph's bones are at least carried around by the Hebrews. This embalmed body, they've carried him around for 40 years in the wilderness. I don't know if they carried him around another 10 or 15 or 30 years in the book of Joshua before they finally planted him, or if they planted him after they got him into Shechem, originally, and now they're just finally getting around to tell us. I don't know, but carrying around an embalmed, mummified version of Joseph for a whole bunch of years is a little bit beyond belief for me. I think they probably buried him years prior to this. They just finally got around to telling him. And one last thing. Eliezer, Aaron's son, finally dies too. And so they bury him. Not at Timnath Serah, not at Shechem, but they bury him in Gibeah, in Shiloh, that other place where the tent of meeting is. That's where they bury Eliezer, the high priest, the son of Aaron. Everything's good. It could not be better as we get to the tail end of the book of Joshua. If it's been a while since you read the book of Judges, let me suggest, as you get ready to read Judges, that you find yourself a seatbelt and put it together. And you might even want to put earplugs in and blinders on, because you're in for a ride for these next 6 weeks. And again, if it's been a while since you've worked your way through the book of Judges, just be aware that there are major portions of this book that are not G-rated, that are not PG-rated, that are R-rated and what used to be X-rated, but is now NC rated. There's a lot of stuff that it stretches credulity that it's in Scripture. That's the thing we have to deal with in the book of Judges. So that is where we are headed to next. Book of Judges, where it looked as if everything was hunky-dory when we got to the end of Joshua. But looky there. They said they were going to do all that was right. But we no sooner turn the page than there are problems galore. And they only get worse as we read the book. So, we'll see you next week, if you dare.